Chair now calls for further amendments to the bill before us. Mr. Blunt.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment, and the gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order on the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Blunt. After subsection G, insert the following new subsection and redesignate subsection, subsequent subsections accordingly.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, that will be the order.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment deals with the whole issue of underserved and unserved, and it deals with wireless voice service, basic broadband service, advanced broadband, advanced wireless broadband, advanced broadband services, and in each of those categories, the amendment just simply says that you would provide grants to unserved areas would have a priority over grants to underserved areas. When you're talking about federal money, I'm sure everyone the contention that an area could be better served is probably universal, and so everyone is going to compete for that underserved area of money granted. What this amendment really does is just simply focusing on unserved areas. I assume that those areas are principally rural, but not exclusively rural. If you have an unserved area, the grant money has to be focused on that area before it can go to provide multiple service in other areas of the country. It's straightforward. I would like to see it put into the bill, and I offer it for discussion and then for a vote, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
The gentlelady withdraws her point of order. Discussion of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Who is seeking?
Mr. Chairman, over here on your left, which is
we'll go to the Democratic side first, and then we'll go back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This is a rural-first amendment, and I do appreciate the sentiment. And if this NTIA grant program for broadband, wireline, and wireless deployment was the only such grant program in the recovery package, I would be much more sympathetic to adopting it. But we have to keep in mind, as we deliberate here in the Commerce Committee, that there is yet another $3 billion for grants in the broader stimulus package for rural areas through the Rural Utilities Service, which is coming through the Agriculture Committee. In other words, there is another $3 billion already targeted for rural priorities through that program. Now, we can debate whether the Rural Utility Service should have that job or not, whether the Agriculture Committee should have that job or not, or whether it would have been better to put all of the money, all nearly $6 billion at the NTIA. But it is the reality, and we need to take legislative note of the fact that rural areas have another $3 billion for broadband elsewhere in the recovery package. I also don't believe an underserved, disadvantaged urban or suburban area in dire need of economic development or revitalization should have to wait for assistance until all rural, unserved areas are reached. We have real economic development opportunities in other parts of the country in addition to rural, but just understand that this nearly $6 billion package includes that $3 billion that goes to rural America, plus the additional rural money that's in this package as well. And I think, having taken note of that, the package as it comes before our committee represents the fair balance that exists in the totality of the stimulus package, and I urge a no vote on this amendment with every member having a clear conscience, knowing that the bulk of the package does go to rural America in its entirety. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I guess we'd had a hearing. I might be able to ask someone else this question, but I guess I'll have to direct it to our counsel if that's okay. On page 3 of the underlying legislation, it refers to unserved and underserved, and I wonder where we have a definition of those two terms, first of all. I mean, I think I understand what unserved is. I'm not sure I understand what underserved means. Is that they only have one carrier, two carriers?
Congressman, the bill directs the FCC to define those terms.
So we punt to the FCC to determine whether an area is unserved or underserved. Is it
correct.
currently undefined by the FCC? So this is a new term we're going to put in statute. Now then, having said that, I note that there are situations later on in the underlying grant program where we are supposed to make a determination that 75% of the money goes to the underserved and 25% maximum goes to the unserved. Is there a reason? Do you know how that number was picked, that ratio? Because I've heard we're going to do rural broadband build-out in this bill.
Congressman, all I can tell you is that the bill directs the NTIA administrator to seek to distribute no more than 75% to underserved and 25% to unserved.
So only a quarter of the money goes to those areas that have no service today, and that's a definition we understand, but 75% will go to areas that may already have some service, but we don't know how that will be defined until NTIA or the FCC defines underserved, correct?
Yes, the bill directs the FCC.
Then let me go to line 23 of the underlying bill, section, I may be wrong here, but it starts with the number 2 and called limitations. And I will read it for you because I believe there's an error in the drafting, and perhaps you can explain it if it's not. It says 2, limitation, the unserved and underserved areas identified by a state in the report required by this subsection shall not represent in the aggregate more than 20% of the population or of the geographic area of such state. Now, does that mean that the money, that there's a 20% geographic limitation here as well as population?
It refers to the report that the priorities report that a state may submit identifying areas within that state to which it would like grant monies directed.
And so if a state had, say, 30% of its geography with no service, as I read this language, they would still fall under a further limitation that no more than 20% of that state would qualify for funds, of that geographic area of that state, correct? So one trumps the other, right?
That's correct, except that the bill doesn't put a cap on 25%. It is endeavor to, or shall seek to, limit. It is not a hard cap.
On the 20%?
On the 25% of the grant funds to be distributed.
Right, we are talking about the 25-75, but I'm also talking about the 20% geography here. But what this says is the unserved and underserved areas of a state cannot be more than 20% of the geography of that state.
No, the recommendation that the state makes to the NTIA can...
So why was 20% picked?
Well, sir, all I can say is that's what the bill says right now.
So I'll direct that to the chairman then, since I don't want to pick on you onto the policy side. Mr. Chairman, can you tell me why 20% was picked in your bill? I would yield to the chairman.
You could yield to me. Well, the numbers were to reflect the fact that we didn't want all the money to go to one area, but to serve both the unserved and the underserved areas. And perhaps Mr. Markey can give you a further explanation.
I'm curious about the 75-25 split and the 20%, because these are numbers that just appear all of a sudden and will be in statute soon.
Let me again restate, just so you can, we'll keep this in this debate, and let's keep it in front of us. All of the money that is coming out of the Agriculture Committee is going to the rural parts of America. That's $3 billion, just so you understand. We have another approximately $3 billion here as well. Okay, just so you understand that.
I understand.
What we have here in the 75%, 25% are aspirational goals. Okay, just so, again, you understand. These are not, it's not hard, it's an aspirational goal that we place here, but understanding that $3 billion right off the top goes to rural America.
Well, let me take reclaiming my time because it's about out. I'm not sure it says that when it says the NTIA shall seek to distribute grants. So it shall seek under this subsection word of the eligibility service. So 75-25 really doesn't mean anything. Then it's just guidance to the agency.
That's correct. It's aspirational, and we're trying to express.
Well, the reason I raise the issue on geography is that, for example, my district's probably 2/3 of the landmass of the state of Oregon and probably represents the most underserved areas in the state of Oregon. And I'm trying to figure out why we would then tell the state you can only have 20% of the geography of the state of Oregon classify under unserved or underserved. And I'm out of time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Stupak is seeking recognition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't get into the 75-25 or 80-20. I agree with Mr. Blunt. I'd like all the money to go to rural areas, and like you, Mr. Walden, my district's very underserved. But these are definitions we've kicked around in this committee for a few years. We've had a number of hearings on what is unserved and underserved. And if you take a look at the latest Farm Bureau and the Rural Utility Services, we tried to tighten up that language. What is unserved and underserved, and we've had those definitions going on. I actually have a second amendment revising the definitions of unserved and underserved. In this bill, we're directing the FCC to come up with these definitions, and the FCC's, based on their information they have now, I don't think they have enough empirical data to do so. But if you remember, we have directed that there be the mapping, the broadband inventory map. And my amendment basically says 90 days after enactment, look at that map. After you get your map done, because the map should be completed by then look at your served, underserved, and use that definition. You have 90 days and 45 days to do it. So I sort of have a clarifying legislation to help us out along this, because many of the questions you raised, I had the same questions based upon all the hearings we've had under Mr. Markey's committee on underserved and unserved.
Would you yield for a
Sure.
question, sir? Thank you. I'm curious because I thought I heard you say that the FCC today does not have the empirical data necessary to define underserved and, well, we know unserved, but not underserved.
Correct.
So I'm trying to figure out how they'll do that in the time frame then that you have now referenced in your next amendment.
Because the broadband deployment map, broadband inventory map, is to be completed within the next 3 months. And you'll give us some empirical data, because right now it's sort of a crapshoot, really it is. The information is not accurate. We saw it when we did the rural utility service and not the last farm bill before that. Places like Houston was considered underserved and getting the money, where areas like yours and mine were being denied based on a number of factors. So hopefully this broadband inventory map will give us a basis from which to start from, and will clarify unserved and underserved. And I'll yield to Mr. Markey. I think he had a few more comments I want to make.
And I thank the gentleman. The FCC does have information on this already, but what we're going to do is ensure that they get additional information so that they can make this determination between unserved and underserved, and they will do so very quickly after the enactment of this legislation. So we're very sympathetic to the fact that rural America is obviously the most underserved, and that's what is reflected in the stimulus package. That $3 billion right off the top goes there to rural America, and these definitions that Mr. Stupak referred to are in terms of the FCC determining and receiving the data, which will determine what is unserved and what is underserved, is going to be obtained very quickly. They already have information, and our goal is to get it out there quickly. Obviously,
the gentleman,
that's the goal of the administration, to see this, these projects begin as quickly as possible.
Would the gentleman yield? And I think Mr. Stupak controls.
Stupak controls the time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question about how quickly then the FCC would be called upon to go through. I assume they would have to go through a rulemaking to come up with this definition, and I wonder how that timeline.
Right. NTIA is supposed to have that map done here hopefully soon.
90 days.
And then they have 9 days after that, 45 days to finalize it.
Yeah, good. Okay, so you're talking 125 days from NTIA?
When they finish the mapping.
And then the FCC
which will take a little bit more time than I earlier said.
And then the FCC would take those data and begin to develop a definition.
Correct, and then at least we have
rulemaking.
NTIA and FCC using the same data to try to determine underserved and unserved.
But then the FCC would have to go through their rulemaking process. Is there a time limit put on them for that?
No.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield?
I got 53 seconds, sure.
Mr. Stupak, under your proposed amendment, is there any definitional restriction for the FCC, or do they still just take this information and they decide? And if so, is there any way we could be more directional in determining how they decide, particularly what underserved means? I'm sympathetic to Mr. Markey's point that some areas don't have all the service they might like to have, but my argument would be that every area potentially could say they were underserved, that they need more competition, that they need more options, and so suddenly you've got people that have not only service but multiple providers are getting this grant money for the new competitor, while people who have no service at all are standing there waiting for another allocation of money, and I'd yield back.
Sure. NTIA is supposed to have that inventory map done. That was directed by Congress. They've been working on it. And what we want is once they have that map, so we really know, because everyone claims they're underserved, especially when there's money laying on the table, everybody's underserved. Okay? So if we get this map done, broadband inventory map, NTIA, then we're urging the FCC to use the same information, same data, so we're all speaking from the same text, and then we'll put the money
Would the gentleman
as
yield?
needed. Yes, I'll yield. My time's up, but I'll yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment, strike the requisite number of words. You know, when you look at this, it's really just saying we're going to set some priorities here, and that I don't think you need a definition for unserved. That means zero. That means nothing, nada. They're not getting anything, and so I don't think that's too difficult to understand. And these people should be a high priority. And I think the gentleman, Mr. Blunt, is just saying that we have so much money and we should look to help the unserved. And for that, I think we should support the amendment, and I think it's a reasonable approach. Thanks.
Further discussion of the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, move.
Mr. Terry, we see.
Yes, sir. Move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, to gentlemen from Michigan and Massachusetts and Florida, I would beg to differ in my observation of how we've come to an understanding in this committee based on the 3 or 4 hearings we had on mapping broadband of what we mean by underserved and unserved. For example, what is typically common in rural areas is that you may have a town of 2,500 people that is served with broadband, but once you get out of the dense, if you can call it denser housing areas, you'll have homes that are unserved, but yet they're still within the territory of that rural provider. So while I think that individual home is unserved, our PSCs or states or someone else may declare that underserved. So we've never really had a hearing, to my knowledge, that focuses on how we distinguish between underserved and unserved. Likewise, when we talk about an urban core, and I'm one of the few guys that sticks up for rural that actually represents urban, you look at the urban core in my district that is served but very much underutilized, but yet I hear in our discussions in some of our past hearings and today that people would assume a definition of underserved in an urban core where no one is using the availability of broadband because of cost or lack of hardware, which is a different issue. And I think there are suggestions within this chairman's mark that we recognize that that's what we mean by underserved in urban core areas, but I'm not sure. And my friend from Michigan, you have greatest expertise on this area and understand rural versus suburban versus urban. I'll yield to you if you can help me work through some of these, and maybe your amendment helps address them.
Well, I think my amendment would help address it. I wish it would have gone before Mr. Blunt's amendment, and I really don't have much argument with what putting money in unserved versus underserved, but as a Congress, as policymakers, NTIA, FCC, they have nothing to base that on right now.
Yeah.
And that's why that inventory map will be critically important. You can have one provider, as you pointed out, and still be unserved because you're without the geographic boundaries. And we know the states have come up with different ways of trying to define unserved and underserved. And there's so many different conflicting views out there. And as I said earlier, I think once you put a pot of money out there like we have in this bill, everybody is going to be underserved. At least that'll be the argument. And every one of us will be calling the FCC, telling them how underserved or unserved we are to get at that money. So what I'm saying is slow this thing down. Let's get the inventory map out, and let's go off that basis. And I urge the
Reclaiming my
NTIA
time
to
for
do
the
it as
last
quickly as
minute.
possible. Sure, go
I
ahead.
agree with you thoroughly. I don't know how we make any policy determinations on what is served, unserved, underserved, adequately served until that map comes out. But I got to tell you, I think it's a real tragedy of transferring our ability to make those policy decisions outside of this committee. I've seen the FCC rule that areas of Mississippi are unserved when we have houses in the middle of Nebraska and the Sandhills that are 50 miles apart that by the FCC's definition weren't qualified. So frankly, just handing this off to the FCC is an atrocious abrogation of our policy duties. And with that, I'm going to at least go with Mr. Blunt's amendment here, but I don't know how we make any decisions here today when we have no clue what the definitions of unserved and underserved are.
With the gentleman yield.
Gentleman's time is
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Chairman, this was a matter that I discussed in my opening remarks, and I want to commend my colleagues for their interest and their comments. I think that to leave this kind of a decision to the FCC with no guidance poses a risk of several things. First of all, inaction by the FCC, which is notorious for not acting on matters of great importance with proper speed. Second of all, we're giving them no understanding of what either underserved or unserved might happen to be, or any of the other nouns or adverbs, or adjectives that might relate to the level of service. Having said these two things, I think we need to give some instruction to them in the report. I think the committee is capable of doing that through its staff. But I would urge that there will be strong need for legislative oversight over this particular matter to make sure that the FCC does not tranquilly go to rest on this matter, or so that the FCC does not simply screw the matter up as they so regularly do.
Gentleman from Michigan, yield to me.
I'm glad to yield to the chair.
I thank you for the points you raise, and I want to indicate that since Mr. Stupak will have an amendment on this very area, which I think makes more sense than the Blunt amendment, I'm going to oppose the Blunt amendment. RUS funds the rural areas already. It's appropriate that our bill also fund less rural areas and promote higher speeds. So we have percentages which are really aspirational. They're not hard and fast. We'll have more data to define some of these areas. There may be more funding for unserved areas depending on applications, but I think we need to focus not just on unserved but underserved so we can get a higher speeds and promote job growth, because this bill is to promote jobs. And we can, I think, in the process of all of this, see that the areas that are unserved as well as underserved get attention, but the real purpose is to get the jobs out there, and I think we ought to recognize what
Would the
Mr.
gentleman
Stupak is proposing.
I have the
Gentlemen-
time, but I'll be
gentlemen-
glad to yield to whoever wants.
Yeah.
Well, then I yield back the
Chairman,
balance of my time.
Chairman, I was asking if you'd yield to me for a moment. Lee Terry.
Mr. Dingell, do you...
Way on the other side.
I'll be glad to yield to Mr. Terry.
Thank you. In response, I just want to add out a little bit. I've done a lot of work and with the RUS, and it's part of their rural economic development, and that's really what we're talking about here. But I've got to tell you, at least in almost every rural state I've been to and looked into, the RUS has made little difference in rolling out broadband in rural areas. It has been the incumbent small telcos who have rolled out advanced services. And it's interesting in small towns, very small telcos, that USF has been more helpful to them than RUS to those communities. In fact, my one experience with RUS is that they came into Omaha, or an applicant was awarded tens of millions of dollars to roll out a wireless broadband in such small towns as Elkhorn, Nebraska, what's in my district. Elkhorn, probably about 20,000 people, is actually inside the Omaha city limits and has the choice of maybe 5 or 6 different broadband carriers. So the unfortunate part is that we may assume that the Rural Utility Service, RUS, economic development grants for broadband are going to the smallest of communities. The realities are they're being used in suburbia to compete. And so I think if we're going to rely on the other $2 or $3 billion that RUS, we need to engage in the debate about whether they're actually going to be used in rural services or not. And I'll yield back my time. I just wanted to help educate my colleagues here on difficulties I've had with RUS trying to get them to actually focus on rural areas. And I'll yield back my chairman, the time back to Mr. Dingell.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion? Mr. Stupak, do you want to offer your amendment as a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to ask, would it be appropriate, since we're getting these definitions, maybe it would be appropriate to offer my amendment as a substitute to the Blunt amendment, if there, of course, unanimous consent.
Let me ask if there's any objection to that. Mr. Blunt, do you have any objection?
I object. I object.
You do object.
I'm inclined to, there's no time here. I object.
Okay. Ms. Eshoo.
I just want to say a few words about the amendment. I appreciate the gentleman offering it because I think that any kind of discussion on broadband is an exceedingly important one. Our country has fallen so far behind that it is a great national source of embarrassment to us. I mean, where the administration, the previous administration, if there was one person that had broadband in a zip code, they included everyone in it. So, you know, I mean, on a bipartisan basis, we know we have a problem. I don't see why we need to get hung up on these definitions. If someone isn't served, if there isn't any broadband, you don't need a definition for that. There simply isn't any broadband wherever it is in East Jesus, USA. All right? Now, on the other part of it, in terms of underserved, in 45 days or less, the FCC can come up with a definition for it. I think the important thing is that the legislation calls for and contains $3 billion for this particular area, for both underserved and non-served. That's the great news. So I don't think we should get ourselves on the ropes in here. I really don't. I think we should take a deep breath and be sensible and say, hallelujah, part of this is being addressed. My issue in all of this is that no one should think that with underserved and non-served and $3 billion that we're correcting and going to bring up broadband penetration, wide broadband penetration to every place in our country and address speeds is going to be addressed by this whole issue, because it's not. And so that really belongs over on the tax side with Ways and Means. I've made a proposal in terms of bonds for broadband in our country. If we could do bonds for the Transcontinental Railroad, we should be doing broadband bonds for our country. So I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Just a little bit of history, just so that we can all feel good about ourselves here. When in 2001, the United States was ranked second in the world in broadband deployment, speed, accessibility, pricing. We've now slipped to 16th in the world. Now, over the last 2 years, as the subcommittee chairman, working with the Republicans, we put together, based upon the Connect Kentucky program, to do broadband mapping for the state of Kentucky, a national broadband mapping bill. Now, the reason that I did that and the reason that we worked with the minority on it was obviously rural America was not being served, and that was a great concern which I had, which is why I introduced the legislation and had the whole series of hearings that we had here in 2007. It was to find where America is not served at all and where it is underserved. And that bill passed out of this committee unanimously to put together that national broadband map, and it was signed by President Bush. So my goal was not to worry about the wealthiest communities in my district in Boston, obviously. It was to worry about the unserved rural parts of our country and the underserved parts of suburban and urban America. That was my goal. Now, what Mr. Stupak's amendment will do is to flesh that out even further. Kevin Martin, however, to our credit again, took note of what we were doing legislatively and initiated his own process to begin to gather more information, which is going to help us to ensure that we expedite this process. So in this distribution of money, actually, the bill before us, which the Obama administration put together, recommends, obviously, that half of it right off the top goes to rural America. But then, for the other half, which is under our jurisdiction, has this other distribution that includes underserved as well. And there are a lot of people in America who aren't in rural America who are underserved. In other words, a person who's underserved should not have to wait until the last unserved person has their access. There should be a way in which suburban and urban America, where it is underserved, are also beneficiaries. So we started this process, this committee, not the Senate, not the Obama team, not the Bush administration. We started it in this committee 2 years ago, and this is the culmination day with, I think, a very fair split in terms of where the money goes, but with 45 days at the FCC to make these definitions so that we can get it out there to rural America as quickly as possible. So we should feel good about what we did because all the leadership came out of this committee on a bipartisan basis, Mr. Stearns, Mr. Barton, Mr. Dingell, myself. So I yield.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are we ready for the question? Let's see. Mr. Boyer is next in seniority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a couple things are concerning me even about the debate. Number one, Mr. Markey, when you led off in your opposition to this amendment, you accused Mr. Blunt and defined his amendment as calling it a rural service first amendment. Well, that beckons then that you define your own legislation then as a city first. That's what's before us. Now, what concerns me most is that when we make judgments on policy, I think that virtues and values ought to be pretty important because we're doing it for a country. And as we do this for a country and you look at virtues and values, we say, you know what? There are certain things that we do that by policy, it's for good conduct and good behavior.
There are other things out there in our society we recognize as bad conduct and bad behavior. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because that for which is bad behavior, we call it shameful. Now, what's shameful? We recognize that things that are shameful, not necessarily may be criminal, there may not be criminal culpability, but shameful conduct, we could see it by, maybe you go, you're having lunch, and 100 people are to be served. And so what? 75% of the people have already gone through the lunch line. 25% of the people haven't even been fed yet. And the other 75% say, you know, I need a little bit more dessert. I didn't get enough meat. I need more vegetables. So they cut in line before the other 25% have even been fed. We all recognize that as shameful conduct and behavior. Now, with regard to our allocations, this committee, we didn't say with regard to handing out the coupons with the digital for DTV, we didn't say we're going to hand out coupons only to where the areas that are selling the most high definition TVs. I mean, come on, I just want to take a time out here. I agree with Mr. Dingell. We should, and with the others that have said, let's not send this off to the FCC and let them decide. See, someone has already made a judgment and are unwilling to come publicly and say what they really mean when they put this together.
With the gentleman,
meaning that an allocation decision has been made. When an allocation decision has been made, then somebody already has expressed their intent.
With the
now,
gentleman
Mr. Markey
yield?
has been. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Mr. Markey has said to us, well, wait a minute. Look what they're doing with regard to ag. He is fighting for the cities. What we should be fighting for is to make sure that people get covered in our society, whether they're an inner city area that is unserved or in a rural area that is unserved. I also would say to the gentlelady that I'll yield to, definitions are pretty important. Definitions are important. You may not think they're important.
I do.
But if you're going to allocate money, definitions are important. And we ought to decide in this committee with regard to these allocations. I'll yield to the gentlelady.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I think all members should turn to page 2 of what is in front of us. Line 5, grants authorized. Line 6, in general, the NTIA is authorized to carry out a program to award grants to eligible entities for the non-recurring costs associated with the deployment of broadband infrastructure. This is very important, going to the point that the gentleman just spoke to. Lines 11 and 12. Broadband infrastructure in rural, suburban, and urban areas in accordance with the requirements of this section. So they are, the only point I want to make is that we're not putting any part of our country ahead of another.
Let me reclaim my time.
Great.
We are. That's what
well,
I say to
this
the
is what the words of the legislation are. So
I'd say to the gentleman, we are. Matter of fact, to Mr. Markey's last comments, what I would say is, if that is your real intent, the real intent that, I wrote down your quote, we should not have to wait until the last unserved is served in an underserved area. Well then, if that's how you really believe, flip the allocation. Just flip the allocation. Make the allocation 75% for the unserved and 25% for the underserved. And I yield to Mr. Markey for his comment with regard to this intent.
Would the gentleman just briefly yield again? Just remember, that in talking about your unfed, remember there's in an adjacent ballroom here, the Agriculture Committee is going to be serving 50% of all the money off the top to unserved America, meaning rural America. It's the rural utility service. So it starts there. Here, we're just adding underserved as well, reflecting the fact that a large percentage of even this $3 billion is going to rural as well, unserved, but that the underserved should also be factored in, because obviously there's economic development for our country.
I want value-based decisions, Mr. Markey. That's the only thing I hope for.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion of the amendment. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would yield my time to Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much. I appreciate my colleague from Michigan doing that. I want to go back through some of the timelines here, because at the back of this substitute, it talks about the FCC having 45 days If you go to page 11, that says that the FCC shall define underserved and wireless voice service, all these things, and it sets up 45-day requirements for definition. Now, we've heard from Mr. Stupak that NTIA probably won't have their mapping done for 125 to 165 days, something like that. But before the maps are done, the FCC is supposed to write definitions. 30 days, no more than 30 days after the FCC is done, the states are supposed to submit. If you look at page 3, not later than 75 days after the date of enactment of this section, each state intending to participate in the program under this section shall submit to NTI this very complex report in order to qualify. So we're going to give our states 30 days after we've given the FCC 45 days in order for them to even participate. Now, I don't know about your state. Mine's pretty good and aggressive. We've got a great PUC, but that's a pretty tight timeline to meet all the other requirements in this bill, including trying to define, and maybe somebody can help me with this one, on page 8, line 8, section 3, this notion of contains concrete plans for enhancing computer ownership or computer literacy in the area. I've not seen the word concrete used in the context of developing a plan, and I wonder what that's all about and where that came from. And I concur with my colleague from Indiana. There have been decisions made, apparently behind closed doors without the minority here involved in those discussions, to decide that 75% should go to the underserved, and 25% to the unserved. That's a policy decision we're sending NTI's way as a proposal, not a shall, I recognize, but you'll have them back here to beat them up pretty bloody if they exceed that in any way. We're delegating the decision-making to FCC on the definitions. And when we're spending $3 billion in a matter of minutes here, we're sending it to an agency where there have been 5, and I believe are there now 4 commissioners currently serving, so it's deadlocked right now at the FCC. So we're down to 3. So it's not, so 3 unelected commissioners at the FCC are going to be given the authority, if you vote for this, to define how to spend $3 billion. If we put all the work into this, why aren't we writing the definition? What's wrong with that? We're the legislators. And I think of all the hearings we've had and oversight hearings we've conducted where we beat up agencies for not following our intent, we need to give them the intent clearly right here, right now. It's our responsibility. I yield to the gentleman. I yield.
Reclaiming my time, I would yield to Mr. Terry of Nebraska.
Thank you. And just to help educate my colleagues here, with the RUS dollars that's under the Ag title, there is no definition under the Ag title of underserved and served. And so under that purposes, or this discussion of, okay, well, the real rural dollars are going to be within the RUS. Let me again explain that I've studied the RUS in their broadband because they wanted to come into areas of Omaha, highly dense areas, suburban areas that were already covered by at least 3 or 4 different carriers. Their argument to RUS to get these funds is, well, we have to go into the dense areas before we can go into the less dense areas, and that was their building model. Well, the whole point, what was confusing to me under the award was that they got to start building in their wireless networks within, broadband networks within Omaha, including one that's right smack almost in the dab of middle of Omaha that's really a blue-collar area that has, I mean, if it's got any animals, it's cats and dogs. And they were going to set up in those areas, but they didn't have a timetable of when they were really going to go into any rural areas. It confused me why they were receiving government grants under a business model like that. But just to point out, as we're discussing this, Mr. Markey, is that there's no guarantees that the RUS funds are going to be used responsibly for rural America.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are we ready for the question? Mr. Shattuck.
Mr. Chairman, I simply want to make the point that I think this discussion is a very worthwhile discussion and very productive, and I think it illustrates the complexity of the legislation that's before us. It seems to me we are debating very serious policies that affect millions of Americans, that allocate scarce resources, which has been pointed out earlier, don't come from today's taxpayers, but will be borrowed and then will become a burden on our children, and quite frankly, even on our grandchildren. And I'm pleased we're having a discussion, but I think it's important that we allocate enough time to all of the issues raised in this legislation, and I think this is a critically important one. And with that, I yield to Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Shattuck. Just a couple of points as final points I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman. One is it's interesting to me that part of this debate is that this committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, would be ceding responsibility willingly to the Agriculture Committee in defining these areas, or to the FCC in defining these areas. This committee should do that work. I believe this committee is better prepared to do that work, not only than any other committee of Congress, but also than any appointed people in a partially populated Federal Communications Commission right now. And what does underserved mean? The chairman mentioned earlier that it may mean you don't have enough, high enough level of speed yet. Certainly, people who are going to apply for grants would like to have federal money to compete in areas that somebody else is already serving, because the market study's already been done, than the more difficult area of serving others. I mean, why don't we define what underserved means? Does it mean you only have one competitor? By definition, it means somebody's providing the service. So why doesn't this committee say in areas that don't have yet 3 competitors, 75% of the money can go before it can go to areas that are underserved? That's really the spirit of this amendment. I appreciate the time we've had to debate it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Reclaiming my time, I only want to make the point that while this bill spends hundreds of billions of dollars, we're talking here about not an insignificant amount of money. We're talking about $3 billion, which we're handing off to a commission to spend. I would suggest that those are important decisions. I've seen us fight on the floor over much smaller amounts of money. It seems to me that we ought to be setting those priorities, and I would associate myself with the comments of Mr. Booyer in terms of who ought to be served first, and whether or not some people are entitled to additional service before others have gotten even their first round. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor of the Blunt amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a recorded vote.
You want a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell? No. Mr. Dingell, no. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? No. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? No. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? No. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? No. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? No. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? No. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? No. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? No. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? No. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Yes. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Aye. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Aye. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Other members seeking recognition? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Mr. Ross votes no.
Mr. Pallone?
Votes no.
Mr. Pallone votes no.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Radonovich?
Mr. Radonovich votes aye.
Mr. Rush?
Mr. Rush votes
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Thank you.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 33. The ayes were 23 and the noes were 33.
The amendment is not agreed to.